Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. My name is Meredith and today we're going to work on getting one step further towards one of my dream projects. I have wanted to do an 18th century chemise a la Reine robe on chemise. There's a bunch of different names for it, which I'll start listing out in the description when we get to that project. But it has some accessories that are just iconic. Whether you're trying to sit around with Marie Antoinette at her lovely little villa, you're wandering around through the countryside, any of these things in the 1780s, you wear one of these lovely straw hats called a Bergere. I'm going to show you how I made mine. I used a lot of thrifted materials. So the hat was actually a vintage woven straw hat that I found for $2. It had the perfect proportions and flat brim. The crown was actually fairly flat and it was like $2 at a thrift store. I then lined it with a silk remnant I found at that same thrift store and some paper spring flowers I picked up at the local craft store, and just some more silk and some trim. But I want to empower you to be able to make your own adorable straw hat and keep yourself clear of sunburns. My friends and I make jokes that I burn like if you look at me sideways. One of my younger brothers is actually so fair that he burned in the shade in his little baby carrier under a blanket once when we were just little babies. So I'm crazy fair. I'm going to be wearing sunscreen all the time, and anything I can wear that they would have in the historical time periods I am trying to costume out of, I am going to be in love with it if it protects me from the sun. I've addressed this with hats in the 16th century with partlets and veils, and today we're going to address it with this lovely thing. So hang tight and I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I'll see you at the end. Straw hats like these were incredibly popular during the 18th century, well before my 1780s Sheppardess aesthetic that we're going for in the next few projects. These could be trimmed with ribbon, with silk, with lace. There's endless numbers of options depending on the decade. And occasionally you start seeing them getting lined on the underside or having these just amazingly huge bows. I kind of tried to do one of those, but I didn't quite get the right amount of loop with mine. So we're going to go with some more modest sized bows. But I really wanted this lined underside to try and help protect me from the sun and keep my hair from getting caught on any stray bits of straw. As I discussed earlier, I'm going to be using a lot of thrifted supplies to make this hat. I've got my straw hat with its very flat brim, a silk remnant that I picked up in their fabric section at that same store, some of my very own clips, some thread in different weights, pliers, scissors, paper flowers, and a decent amount of silk ribbon. I do change the ribbon I'm going to end up using throughout this process, just because I decided I liked a different color better to match the silk lining I've already picked out. But first things first, because I want to make sure I have enough of this silk, we're going to lay everything out, and I need to go around the edge, making the rough shape of my brim so that I have enough silk to finish lining the entire underside of this hat. When it comes to adding the seam allowance, more is better than less right now. I can always trim off my excess, and I will later on in this tutorial, but I want to make sure I've got enough that I'm not overly concerned with my lack of silk in order to cover this brim. Any excess I can also pull into the crown and help to ease that seam, because I am going to have to cut a separate crown piece to line the inside of it. But we're just going to connect all of these chalk lines together, make the circle, and then start cutting it out. One feature of this hat that's going to make it really interesting to repurpose are these little metal grommets that they've already punched inside. This is not something that I was able to find in any of the museum examples I took a look at. However, it is going to make putting my ribbons through much easier, but I first got to get rid of that tie. And now we're going to try and center my lining and attach the edges, so that I can whip stitch around that edge and keep the lining in place where it needs to be. These stitches don't have to be necessarily the neatest, most even, or even particularly small. You can do a large basting stitch just whipping around the edge of your hat. And the larger those stitches are, the less damage you're probably going to be doing to the straw. If you're able to not do a lot of damage, or if you can sew the hat together like I'm doing, you can also unpick it and remake the hat later if you're wanting to change the style, change the lining, or just go without a lining altogether. These adorable little claws can be found at a lot of different quilting stores. I can't think of any in particular just because mine were given to me as a Yuletide gift a couple of years ago from one of my sewing friends. But you'll also find them super handy not only when it comes to making hats, but doing leather work. Sometimes if you've got a particularly dainty fabric you're working with, or multiple layers of fabric. I think a lot of quilt shops end up selling them, and that might be where she found hers. And now that that's all sewn down around the edge, and we just got to trim off that excess, so we're not going to need that at this point. I played with self-binding the edges with it, but there just wasn't enough on my initial cutout. And we are going to feel the bump of our crown around the edge, trace that out with some chalk, and then cut inside. Make sure you're not cutting directly on the chalked line. That way you leave yourself seam allowance to be able to tuck everything under and stitch it down. You're also, because this is a curve, going to want to just do a couple little slits around to try and make that curve work a little bit easier and expand around your head. Then you're just going to tuck these under and start to make sure everything is in place. I would not close it up at this point just because you need a way to attach cleanly your ribbon ties that are going to keep this hat on your head. Next up, we need to cut the puff version of a hat band that we're going to make for this. My hat band ends up being 4 inches wide of the silk, and I just cut a giant rectangle, and it goes almost the width of this fabric. If I'd honestly had more of the fabric in this little chunk I was cutting off of, I probably would have used the whole thing and just had really big puffs, like the museum example. As it is, mine's just gonna fit right around that brim. I did pre-measure the brim and compare it to this section of my silk fabric to make sure that I was going to have enough. You'll notice I'm not even going to worry about serging the ends, stitching them under, turning this into a tube, etc. If it was on a garment, I would probably finish these raw edges. But as it is, we are just going to butt the ends together, now that I know I have enough to go around the crown of my hat with a little bit of wiggle room. And these raw edges are all going to get turned under as I'm making the poofs. And the poofs and sewing them down are actually going to keep all of the raw edges pretty well encased. If you're planning to put your hat through the wringer, live in a particularly windy area, maybe it would be worthwhile finishing those puffs. You do you. I decided I was going to skip that step from my hat. To pick out the number of poofs I'm going to make, I just divided the poofs down equally. And then I'm going to measure around the crown and make some points on the crown just to make sure that my poofs match up with those points. This is going to keep me from making extra poofs. It's also going to let me use the fabric I do have on this hat band to make the biggest poofs I can, given that it is a slightly scantier bit of silk compared to the extent example that I showed you at the beginning, which had these big loopy bows. Something to remember with using a thrifted hat like this, it may have warped on one end or the other over the years, and you're going to need to be able to not only measure but also kind of eyeball out your measurements. And to just make my life easier, I am drawing straight across for the lines I need to run my gathering stitches for my puff trim. This is going to help speed along making my puffs. I should stress, I've never made one of these hats before, nor have I ever made the puff trim that you see in the 18th century on hats or dresses. So this is all just my best guesswork based on watching a couple other tutorials, looking at some historical pieces, as well as looking at some of the period art, and trying to figure out what would make sense. So I'm running a lot of gathering stitches. Then I end up tucking those raw edges underneath and either whipping around or trying to tack the edges of this behind. That way I center all of those raw edges farther back and make it less likely they're going to be popping out.
Again, if it was on a dress, I would probably just make a giant tube and go from there. But with a hat, it shouldn't need a backing quite that badly. When it came to attaching the hat band of puffs to my hat, I lined up the center of each of my puffs with my little chalk markings and started stitching them down. There was a lot of flipping back and forth between the top of the hat and the underside, trying to make sure that I caught the silk underneath in a attractive way that was going to make it easier for me to tuck under the crown silk as I went. Again, I didn't want to tack down the inside of that crown or finish lining the crown until after I had put this trim on. That way, if there was any stitching that wasn't ideal, I would be able to hide it with the crown lining just a little bit more. I ended up not needing the pliers that I had brought for this particular part of the project because I have my thimble, and just decided to use my thimble to start stitching back and forth through the straw and through the silk. As a pro tip now at this point, I'm going to recommend, if you can, go through the weave rather than through the individual stalks of straw. That will help keep the hat a little bit stronger. Then I end up taking a little bodkin, running it through these little metal grommets and to the back side. That way I can fold them together neatly and just pin them in place until I am ready to stitch these shut. I probably could have done it right here and now, but I didn't know that at the time. So just pinned it in place while I waited to stitch in the crown in a little bit. But first I wanted to deal with the giant binding that needed to go around the edge. That's how I decided I wanted to finish this off, based on the example of a lined Bergere I found at the Met. And after trying it with silk ribbons and just not liking what I had in my stash, I cut a piece of bias tape and decided to iron a fold into it. That way I would be able to center the edge of the hat into the fold and start clipping everything in place to sew it down. So this is me attempting to get the edges of my bias tape to go underneath properly to encase all those raw edges, and it is not working with just doing a single fold down the middle of the bias tape to have the edge of the hat go into. So I end up taking off all of the bias that I clip on and deciding to iron in a secondary round of folds. That way I'm not having to fight with it every inch of the entire brim. This brim ended up being about 44 inches around once everything was said and done. So that would have taken forever. And frankly, the binding around the edge was the part of the entire project that took the longest. It was the most sewing, and anything you can do to make this part easier on yourself, I would highly recommend. If you find a ribbon that you enjoyed, the ribbon actually was easing very nicely, and you can get some really awesome silk ribbon at different historical costuming vendors. I just was not having a nice one in my stash at this point. This part went so much faster after I got all of the bias ironed with the 2 folds, not just a single one, and using the clips rather than trying to bind the edge with pins or anything like that. I was able to do about half of the hat at a time just because I didn't quite have enough of these clips. I did end up ordering more after this project because I see a lot more hats in my future. I didn't realize how much I missed making them until I was working on this particular project. They are not necessarily the historically accurate way to address this particular portion of your project, but it was the easiest and least destructive way I had to take care of the straw hat. So you never know, I may want to remake it at some point. I love my little puffs, but maybe I want it to be pink or white. So the tricky part of putting the binding on was I decided I was going to do it the top first and then tack down the bottom side. Through this project you're going to see me, if you pay really close attention to my hand underneath the brim, pulling the binding away from where I'm stitching and just letting it sit underneath the pads of my fingers. That way I don't accidentally catch it. Yes, this does mean I have to go around the hat twice, but after I did try to just stab straight through back and forth, I was starting to break some of the straw as I was going through the grass rather than around the leaf of the grass. I guess if it was a brand new straw hat, that might not be as concerning, but this is a bit more of a vintage piece, and I would rather not damage it more than I need to. The bright side about doing a lining, in addition to it not catching on your hair as much, is that it gives me a good place to hide all of the different strings. As I'm sewing this binding on, I can just stick them through the binding itself, or I can bury the needle underneath the lining of the brim and kind of wiggle my finger over those holes. Once the top portion is in place, the bottom goes by so fast, and I'm just pulling this slightly over to hide my raw edges and my bad stitching. To line the inside of the crown, I just took one of the oddball shaped scraps of silk from cutting everything else out, kind of made a rough circle out of this interesting triangle-like shape. Hi Zoe! Everyone say hi to Zoe. Anyway, you go through here, start cutting everything out. But this is nowhere near a perfect circle, and we all know that. If you're expecting it to be off of those quick chocolate marks, you have way more faith in my skills of geometry than I do. So we're going to edge all of that and even it out. And now, the fun part, we're going to ease all of this in. It is slightly bigger than the crown itself, but that's okay. We're going to add some extra pleats, and this is something I'm going to use the pins for, because there's not a good way for those clips to grab. So having some straight pins on hand is actually pretty handy, and if they're the little glass-edged ones or the little glass-headed ones, you can get a little bit more leverage, I find, on this particular portion. Note that as you're sewing this down, you can ease out more of the seam allowance. to get more fabric into the crown if that's your wish, or you can use this as more of a suspension to keep it just perched on the top of your head rather than sitting down into the interior portion of the crown. And once you have the brim and the crown linings pinned together in a way that makes you happy, with the spacing and the depth, you're just going to whip stitch the edges of this together. It doesn't need to be super fancy. I would try and make it neater than you've used when you were whip stitching down the edge of your brim, because you're not going to have an additional binding to try and hide any sideways or weird looking stitches. It should be small, neat, and hard to see. This is also the portion of my hat making where I end up stitching the ties together around the faces of themselves. That way I'm able to enclose the ties with the crown lining and not have to worry about cutting off my string. I can just do it all in one single go. Made life super easy for me, and it actually gave me a little bit cleaner of a finish compared to one of the historic examples I saw the underside of. And with that, you actually do have a completely historically accurate look to the hat. You don't have to add the flowers I'm about to. That was mostly me wanting to be a little bit extra and add a little bit more of that 1780s pop. You don't see the flowers as much earlier, but definitely as you get into the pastoral shepherdess chic look that Marie Antoinette was making popular, you were definitely able to start adding some more flowers around the edges of these hats. So don't take this as me saying they never put flowers on their hats earlier. They absolutely did. Maybe just not in conjunction with this. So with that, I'm not even sewing my flowers in really. I'm using the hatband as a hatband and kind of slipping them underneath until they feel secure, maybe going through one or two of the loops, and also using them to make sure that the raw edges that are underneath aren't going to be poking out. Whether that's rounding off the edges of the wire with my pliers, or doing any number of little cuts and such.
And that's the completed Bergere. I hope you've enjoyed getting to watch this tutorial, and please tag me on Instagram. It's at meredith.smith. If this inspires you to make your own, I am so excited to get to see what you make, and I hope you're going to enjoy getting to watch me in my next phase when I replace this modern sundress with an 18th century chemise a la Reine. In the meantime, I hope you have a fabulous week, and keep sewing, my friends. Bye.